Okay, so my name is Zev Rudman, Rabbi Zev Rudman of Aish. We're going to be doing a class which is called National Revelation. National Revelation is a very important link within the Discovery Seminar. It's about a number of questions, but really one very basic question. Let's start with the following idea. The whole idea of Discovery is that there was a Torah that was given to the Jewish people 3,200 years ago, and we're looking at evidence as to where they came from, who was the author, etc., etc. However, the link that we want to talk about over here is the idea of transmission. Meaning, if, let's even say there was a doctrine, there was an event that took place historically that many years ago, how can we talk about an accurate transmission, an accurate rendition of that over the course of all of these years in terms of 3,300 years ago? Whether we're talking about a written law or an oral law, as we keep on talking during the course of this class for the next hour, but even before that, there's a more basic idea, which goes like this, okay? You know, most people, I don't know about this group in particular, but many people, if you ask them about what they picture happened, as you can see on the screen in front of you, I mean, that's the picture of the desert somewhere, so maybe that actually does look like the Sinai, for those who remember having really traveled through the Sinai desert, and climbing Jebel Musa and climbing to the top of what is, for some reason, traditionally assumed to be Har Sinai, although there's all kinds of interesting research and different mountains which people claim it to be. But over here, the question is really what happened. The truth is, if you ask most people, what they'll think about what happened in Mount Sinai really is based on the following slide. Who's that? Most famous Moses of all times. Right, holding the tablets. And most people, what? No, it's actually not. It's written in Greek. Yeah, you're right. It's written in Greek. Correct. It's written in Greek. And exactly, most people have this idea. Charles Wesley spoke English, and when Moses spoke English, where Moses is. And actually, a friend of mine was one time teaching a course in an advanced, rabbinic seminary, and he asked the students whether or not the splitting the Red Sea went from the Jewish people to the other side, or from the other side towards the Jewish people, or maybe from the middle. And immediately everyone said from the Jewish people towards the other side. He said, how do you know that? Because that's the way it was in the movie. And we have this imprinted within us from where we started from in terms of such images. But if we want to think about it a little bit more clearly, a little bit more rationally, the Mount Sinai experience is actually a very fascinating thing to think about in the following way. When we talk about the Sinai experience, so if you ask most people, they'll say, even someone who accepts the Torah, even someone who believes in the Jewish people, and the Torah and God, they'll say, okay, there was something, maybe there was, but it's a legend, it's a myth. It's not something which we can talk about in any kind of historical accuracy. And if we think about it, if we compare things that are legends and myth, for example, there was someone, George Washington, and he cut down the cherry tree is a legend. That he was the first president of the United States is a fact, okay? And so on and so forth. We look at these different ideas, and we find Atlantis sank, Pompeii was destroyed by a volcano, she let them eat cake, she actually never said that, and other such things which are based on some kind of historical, underpinning, but ultimately they're not actually true. They're embellished, they're expanded, they're not really what it's in. What happened, people have this desire to want to try to always add to it, to make it greater than it actually is. So therefore, a key question to talk about in terms of the idea of God giving the Torah to the Jewish people over 3,300 years is how can we have any kind of feeling about this, any kind of evidence, any kind of process, in a way that this is something which somehow doesn't develop into legend or myth or expand over and over, but it's something which we can talk about as, rather than a legend or myth, some kind of historical fact. What's fascinating is the following. If you think about all the many different religions that exist in the world, and this is just a small sampling of them, it's actually very fascinating. If we were going to start a religion, we would go to a cave somewhere in the desert, we were going to start a religion. What would be the best way to start? Every religion begins with that God communicated to the people and told them what he wanted, right? So what would make more sense? Think about it. God spoke to a large number of people, or God spoke only to me? Which would be more convincing in terms of religion? To a large number of people, right? So therefore, we think about all the different religions that have started throughout the history of the world. Whether, I'm not making any value judgments, they're correct, they're not correct, they're real, they're not real, they're true, they're false. One would expect that over the course of looking at many different religions, that they would be started, many of them would be following the same basic sociological pattern, which would make them more believable and verifiable if they were started by large amounts of people. For example, if I was going to start a religion based on the following story, the Archangel Gabriel appeared to me and gave me golden tablets written in language that no one other than myself can read. However, if anyone sees these golden tablets, they will immediately be stricken dead. So therefore, I'm going to sit behind the curtain with these golden tablets, reading them to you in English, because no one else can read them, no one else understands the language that they're in. And then, you're going to write it down in English, but at the end of the process, no one's going to see the golden tablets because the Archangel Gabriel is going to come back and bring them back up to heaven, and then we're going to have a religion based on that. Sounds like a good idea how to start a religion? Which religion is that?
Wizard of Oz.
That's really good. Okay, not the Wizard of Oz, but Mormonism, Joseph E. Smith. That's how we started in upstate New York. Reading from golden tablets, whether true or not, I'm not making any value judgments about them, but reading from golden tablets behind a curtain to secretaries one after the other, which she then proceeded to marry a number of them, which is where the idea of polygamy in Mormonism begins from. And then there's a whole religion based on that. And therefore, so my question really is, why did Joseph E. Smith begin with saying that God came and spoke to 10,000 Mormons in, I don't know, if anyone knows the geography from New York, I don't know, by Lake Erie or something, on a big mountain somewhere in Bear Mountain, upstate New York, the Lord appeared and spoke to all 10,000 Mormons and told them that. What would be the problem with starting a religion like that? What's the simple answer? Where are those 10,000 people? Right? So therefore, what's fascinating is if you go through all of the many various different religions that we have on this page, and even many more, there's exactly one religion in the world that actually tries to do that and says that the revelation from God to the people of that religion took place in a mass revelation. If that's the optimal way to do it, one would expect that whatever works, we find throughout history, right, throughout sociology, throughout political history, that if an idea works, it ends up being copied from one place to another. Something is good and it works, it's used in many different places. So if this would seem to be the optimal way by which to start a religion, why is there only one religion in the entire world that actually uses that approach, which happens to be Judaism? Now, if I can sort of switch gears for a moment. I was reading papers, it must have been about a year and a half ago already, and there was a news report. The last survivor of the Titanic just died. It was one of the babies who was rescued from the Titanic, right? Women and children first. Someone passed over a baby. This baby lived to be about 100 years old. This woman died somewhere around the 100th anniversary of the Titanic. And the reason why that hit me was for the following reason. I realized sometimes during our lifetime, the last survivor of the Holocaust is going to pass away. Think about it. Holocaust is 1945. That's almost 70 years ago. Sometime in the next 30, 40 years or so, already now, you can read whatever, I keep track of Holocaust history in terms of some of my teaching, and every once in a while you see a small thing that says the last survivor of this particular concentration, the last known survivor of this particular concentration camp just passed away, right? Or, for example, talk about it in terms of Jewish tradition, the last surviving student of a well-known yeshiva that existed in Europe before the war just passed away, the last person who had been a rabbi in Europe before the war just passed away, and bit by bit, we're losing that connection. So therefore, one would therefore think that another 20, 30, 40 years, all of the Holocaust deniers are going to have a field day, right? Because at least now, anyone, you can walk down the street here in Jerusalem and you're more or less, you're bound after a couple of minutes to run into someone who actually is a survivor and actually has their number tattooed on them. But in a certain point, 20, 30 years from now, we're not going to anymore. So what are we going to do? What are we trying to do to make sure that that can happen? So we're collecting evidence, we have museums, we have international Holocaust ages, Holocaust educations, there's Yad Vashem, in every major capital of the world, there's a Holocaust museum. Whenever anyone tries to deny or diminish it, or in any way make it any less, so then there's immediately a furor and an outcry. And the reason is because it's such a mass event that so many people knew about. And there's so much evidence and there's so much documentation that the attempt to try to diminish it or deny it is in a sense doomed to fail. Same thing is true also in terms of the Torah. It's actually very interesting. Many of the processes by which we try to remember the Holocaust, or whether consciously or unconsciously, fashioned on the remembrance of the Torah. What's the key event for Jews? It's very interesting. I was just reading about this. Did anyone read the Pew report on American Jewry that just came out last week?
On the New York Times.
In the New York Times. So it's from the Pew Research Center, which did it. I read the the synopsis of the report, which is about 15 pages, which itself is like, you can then click on the link and read all 150 pages. Not the best stuff. But it was a very fascinating article about the changing demographic of the American Jewish community. And fascinating is not the right word to say. It's actually a very sad article. And it divided up different ways that Jews relate to their Jewishness, and as a result, the different choices they make in their family life, in their social life, in their outlook on religion. But what's very interesting, actually, in terms of this is the following. What's the key structure of the Jewish religion? Is that a clear question?
Family.
The family, right? Not the synagogue. Not the synagogue. Okay? The family is the key structure of Jewish religion. Which is the major Jewish family event of the year, in a religious sense? No, not Shabbat. Even more than Shabbat. Where is it a requirement for the family to get together and parents and children? Passover, right? The way it's written in the Bible is, you gather to you're supposed to gather your children and your grandchildren together, and they're supposed to ask questions. What are we doing here? And the rabbis, over the course of generations, devise the whole system by which we go through it, and we do all kinds of, the adults do things which are meant to cause the children to ask questions, and then we'll respond, because obviously something which is learned experientially is that much greater than something that's just recited by rote. I know families that put on plays, that decorate the house, they have those little frog things that, little springs, they jump up randomly at different times. You ever see them? They leave them on the table randomly in the middle of the Passover table, so there are frogs jumping around. I don't know if that's actual lice, that would be going a little bit too far. But I'm saying all of that is about the family, the transmission. This is what I heard from my grandfather, I heard from his grandfather, going all the way back, right? And the same way, parallel, there's testimony about the Holocaust, and children are encouraged to do research about their grandparents or great-grandparents who may have gone through the Holocaust and what their experiences were. The same thing, that's an imitation, whether consciously or unconsciously, of the whole process of the Jewish religion, which is about, I heard from my grandfather, I heard from his grandfather, we get as many generations as we can together around the table, and we go all the way back, right? And it's a very powerful experience when it's done in the proper way. I'd like to ask a question. If the Jewish religion was fabricated by a few people in a cave in the desert, or it's myths or it's legends, where did it start? Meaning, if we were in a cave in the desert, the seven of us, right, we decided we're starting a new religion, we're going to call it Judaism, we're going to tell everybody that God came down and spoke to the Jewish people on that side. So we write this all down in a nice scroll, we say, wait a minute, who did he talk to? So someone goes, you know what? He spoke to the entire nation, right, all 3 million people. Wow, that's great. Everyone's going to believe that. And we walk out, and we come to the first group of Jews we're going to try to convince to believe in our religion. And we say, guess what? We just got the revelation of the Torah from God. And they say, wow, that's really interesting. Maybe it's a good religion, because everyone's willing to hear. People are willing to be convinced. And they say, okay, what does it say? They start reading through the book. They get to the part that says that the entire Jewish nation, men, women, and children, were there at the revelation of God at Mount Sinai. The person looks at us and says, well, I wasn't there. And you just wrote the entire nation was there. No one was missing. In fact, there's a whole process. If you read in chapter 19 in Exodus, it describes at great length how Moses and God, and so to speak, Moses together, organized it that every single Jewish person was able to be there. Anyone who was ritually impure, they pushed off giving the Torah an extra day to give them a chance to purify themselves. Not a single person had any excuse to not be there. So if we come out of the cave, out of the desert with this book that says in it that everyone was there, what's the obvious question people are going to ask us?
We weren't there.
We weren't there. So we'll say, you know what? It was your great-great-grandparents. So actually just read to anyone following in Hungary. Did anyone read about this? How one of the leading neo-Nazis in Hungary, who was like one of the leaders of the most far-right party in the Hungarian parliament, whatever you call it, and it turned out that he's actually Jewish. His mother was Jewish. His mother's mother was Jewish. He's Jewish technically, halachically, in every possible way. He's actually Jewish. So nowadays, yes, okay, someone could not know they were Jewish. I had a student like that also, very similar story. But the truth is, if you go over to someone and say, well, your great-great-grandfather, okay, it wasn't you, you're right. Your great-great-grandfather was at the revelation of the Torah on Mount Sinai with another 3 million people. So what would someone's reaction to that be? This slide means we're supposed to think that. Right? Okay, this is like brand new. Okay, all these presentations are brand new. But if we're talking about 3 million people being there, because when it says 600,000 people, that's only talking about heads of households. and there were wives, and there were children, there were people who were over the age of 60. So if we're talking about a minimum of 3 million people, so then, one second, my great-great-grandfather was out at this unbelievable event, and he never got together and told us about it? My great-grand, where I see most people here are already not as young as the groups we usually have, So older people have a little bit of a tendency to repeat stories over and over again to their children and grandchildren, right? And my grandfather never told me about it, and my grandfather never told me about it, and my grandfather never told me about it. So even though it makes a lot more sense to start a religion like that, anyone who would think to step past that would say, but how am I going to do it? You can fool, all the people some of the time, some of the people all the time, but I can't go ahead and fool everybody in that there was an unbelievable cataclysmic event. And for example, I think it's the next slide on here. Here we go. Imagine the New York Times headline like this, right? North America went underwater in the 17th century. Researchers claim that the entire northern continent was in fact underwater in 1645 from January through April. So we'd be able to tell people that. There are people whose great-great-great-great-grandparents, I know there's someone in New York whose name is still Stuyvesant or something, who's a descendant of the original Stuyvesant or whatever it is, and they'll be able to say, no, it's not true. We would have heard about it. We would have known about it. So therefore, where such a great cataclysmic event took place, but no one knew about it, and you write it in this book, and then you try to foist it on everybody as being true, it's just not going to work. Which is why no other religion in the entire world, it's a pretty good Photoshop work over here, messing with the New York Times, right? And which is why no other religion in the world ever tried to do such a thing. Actually, it's not 100% true. Buddhism actually did say the same thing. Buddhism said that Buddha appeared to the entire nation, to a couple of million people. However, they came up with there's a good way around this. They then said all of those people who were there died, and they've come back as reincarnations over the course of the next generations. So that's why no one heard about it afterwards, because everyone who was there at the Revelation died, and they're only coming back now as reincarnated souls. Which could or could not be, but I have no way of knowing that. But if we talk about a transition process that goes back, and it's actually very interesting. We're talking about the Torah was given traditionally 3,300 something years ago. It's demonstrable, we're going to talk about this in a few more moments, it's demonstrably proven that the Torah as we have it existed in basically the same fashion 2,500 years ago. Which means the gap where there's no, so to speak, written evidence for is about 800 years. To imagine the course of 800 years, which is not that many generations, not that many people, we're talking about 800 years, we're not talking about a tremendous amount of people, that there was somehow or other within that period of time, there was some kind of mass hallucination that everyone in the nation began to believe that their great-great-grandfather was at this event. It's a little hard to figure out how such a thing can work. Right? It's a little bit hard to try to imagine this. And the Torah itself actually makes this point. For example, Deuteronomy writes, only beware for yourself and greatly beware for your soul, lest you forget the things that your eyes have beheld, and lest you remove them from your heart. And it says, when Hashem said to me, gather the people to me, and I shall let them hear my words. Hashem spoke to you from the midst of the fire. Meaning, some people actually recite these verses every day at the end of the prayer service as a reminder. Remember, don't forget, pay attention, that we're not talking about an event that took place in private with one person and another person, or one person and God. We're talking about an event that took place in front of the entire nation. That's where the revelation, the belief system begins. Or another verse, also in Deuteronomy, and it says it very clearly, has the people ever heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire as you have heard? From heaven he caused you to hear his voice. I mean, the Bible itself, and again in Deuteronomy, again in chapter 5, I think they overdid a little bit over here, but Maimonides actually codifies this in the following way. And he says, Israel did not believe in Moses, our teacher, and account of the miracles he performed. For when one's faith is based on miracles, doubt remains in the mind. These miracles may have done through the occult and witchcraft. What then were the grounds of believing in Moses? The revelation or sign which we saw with our own eyes, heard with our own ears, not having to depend on the testimony of others. Says Maimonides, this is one of the 13 principles of faith, that we believe in the transmission of the Torah and Mount Sinai, but not because of miracles. Not because Moses, we don't believe in God because Moses split the sea. We don't believe in God because Moses brought down manna for 40 years. We don't believe in God because of the 10 plagues. We believe because there was an experience, the entire Jewish people standing there at Mount Sinai, participating with Moses as God communicated with the Jewish people. And they were then commanded to tell this to the generation after and the generation after, all the way throughout the generations as we get together and we do this. And it's a very powerful piece of evidence here we are finished, in terms of trying to imagine a different scenario, how such a myth, if such a thing was a myth or a legend, how you were able to go ahead and propagate and continue and transmit such a myth or such a legend over the course of over such a large nation as a whole, not just in terms of individuals and not just in terms of myths or legends like, you know, for example, Atlantis disappeared, right? Atlantis is the famous, you know, alleged tremendously great city that disappeared and sunk under the ocean, but there's no one left who can talk about it. Or if you want to talk about George Washington and the cherry tree, so then George Washington did it, then okay, no one really saw it. But a legend or myth, which is talking about something which is a mass event in front of an entire nation that was of tremendous importance, and then they're commanded to pass it on to all the generations afterwards. You have to ask yourself how such a myth or legend could develop if there wasn't some kind of evidence or truth for it beforehand. Now, I will be very honest. If you search National Revelation on Google, you will find there are, you know, sites, there are, you know, and everyone's supposed to think. Thinking, asking questions, arguing is one of the most Jewish things that you can do in the entire world. And there are sites which try to bring counter arguments using ideas in the study of folklore or mythology, or ideas in the study of different kinds of anthropology and the development of myth over the course of generations. What can I say? I've read some of them. I've gone through some of the counter arguments. Everyone's welcome to look at them and see what they say. Of course, in this day and age, all information is available. No one's trying to hide anything from anybody. I'm much more convinced by the argument than the counter arguments. Everyone has to figure out themselves what evidence they're going to accept. I personally dislike very much in the context of discovery using the word proof. Proof is a much too powerful word. Evidence is something that everyone has to look at and figure out and then decide based on the evidence how they view the sum total of the evidence that's placed in front of them and what the consequences and what the meaning of that evidence is. So this is the first part of the class, which as I said, this is what we call the idea of national revelation. That's the first part of the class. But as I started, I said the whole idea of transmission of ideas and documents and laws itself is difficult to try to figure out. And here we don't have a cute little presentation to use. I'll use the board. Let's talk about this in the following way. We have a Torah, right? Written down in Hebrew, transmitted over 3,300 years. Anyone have any clue how many words or letters there might be in the Torah? You just heard it, right?
Yes,
Okay.
800.
About 80,000 words,
80,000.
304,805 letters. Okay? Let's say you type really, really well. You're unbelievably accurate. You're 99.99% accurate. That means how many mistakes do you make? If you're 99.99% accurate, you make one mistake in every... Anybody? Math?
10,000.
1 in every 10,000, which means if I'm fiendishly accurate, 1 in 10,000, how many mistakes am I going to make in the Torah? 30. 30 mistakes. Right? Has anybody here ever read a book and there's a mistake and there's a word that's printed incorrectly?
Sure.
Yeah, all the time, right? Not even talk about websites or things like that. I'm saying just even printed books that were printed and proofread and copyrighted and copyread and over and over and over again, and you find mistakes all the time, right? So how can we talk about an accurate transmission of a large written document, especially when you see nowadays it's actually a little bit easier. Anyone who's, again, slightly older crowd than usual. People who remember using typewriters and whiteout? Yeah, okay, right, okay. Different crowd, right, okay? But nowadays it's actually much easier. I remember my papers I wrote in college. If I made a mistake, I had to go back in, white it out, try to fit it back into the typewriter in exactly the right place, type over the whiteout, make sure the whiteout was already dry because not it's smudged, and look terrible, and whatever. Nowadays, it's actually very easy. If I write a book, for example, a friend of mine recently published a book, and I've been going through it, and whenever I find a mistake, I email him, and he just goes into the original file, changes that one letter, or that one word, and the next time he prints it, the odds are it's going to be that much better because he doesn't have to redo the whole thing from the beginning again and reintroduce new mistakes, right? Which actually makes things much easier. But a Torah scroll is not done by computer. A Torah scroll is written by hand. So if I'm fiendishly accurate, 99.99%, I'm going to make 30 mistakes, right? Just to show you what the definition of a mistake is. When King James printed the Bible for the first time in the 1600s in England, they made a mistake. They left out 3 letters. They left out the letters in English, which were O, N, and T. You know where they left them out? They left them out in the 7th commandment. Which is the 7th commandment?
No.
What?
No.
No, Lechach is towards the end. Is 9 or 10. What? No. What? Lo titzrach is the 6th, right? So what's the 7th? What comes after thou shalt not commit murder? What? Lo tignob is 8. Number 7. And so we read, whatever. No, between tirtzach, it's between tirtzach and tignob. No, tachmod is after. No, that's also after. The 10 Commandments, but you see, let's go watch the movie, you know? Okay, verse 5, yeah. Now, it's lo tin'af. What is lo tin'af? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay? If you leave out the letters O, N, and T, what does it say? Thou shalt commit adultery. And that's how they printed and disseminated and they sold the Bible. When King James heard about it, he got really upset. He had the people who printed it and proofread it, hung, drawn, and quartered. And he had all the copies destroyed. There's a few copies left. It's collector's items known as the Sinner's Bible. Okay? But I'm saying if you leave out 3 letters, change the whole meaning of what it's about. Right? So we're talking about, if I'm fiendishly accurate, 99.99%, how can I talk about an accurate book that's been transmitted over the course of 2,300 years? Well, how can you National Revelation, what we did till now, talks about the general idea. The accurate transmission of such a document, is hard to imagine. So, see, if we had the original, it would be much easier. Whenever we have a question, we go back to the original, and we see what it says. But the original Torah scroll, according to Jewish tradition, when King Solomon built the temple, he had a premonition, he had a prophecy, whatever you want to call it. There was a potential exile and destruction coming up at some point. He built a secret chamber under the Temple Mount, where the original luchot, the original tablets, the original Torah scroll could be hidden away. Sometime one of his descendants, about 10 generations later, the King Yoshio, about 300 years later, realized that he saw the end begin to approach as the different tribes and different kingdoms from the east, in the area of Mesopotamia and the Empire of Aram, were getting more and more power. He hid it away. And traditionally, since then, even when they returned to rebuild the Second Temple, they did not take it out of that chamber. And they left it there, and traditionally it's still underneath the Temple Mount somewhere. And we're not going to go look for it. That would get everyone in the Middle East very upset. And therefore, it would be very simple. You're not sure if your version is accurate. Go back to the original and see what it says. But how can we talk about an accurate Torah scroll? Right? So there's a number of techniques. I'll talk about a few of them. One of them is actually very fascinating. It's actually very Jewish. Anyone here read from the Torah scroll? At some point, maybe at their bar mitzvah or something, if anyone remembers it. Yeah? So what happens when someone makes a mistake when they're reading from the Torah scroll and synagogue? See, I always imagine it's like a nice Episcopalian. I like to imagine. So imagine if the Episcopalians, right? Nice upper middle class American church had a Torah scroll reading and someone made a mistake. It would be like this. Excuse me, did you make a mistake? Right? What happens if someone makes a mistake when they're reading the Torah scroll in synagogue? Anyone, doesn't make a mistake, Ashkenazi, anyone, right? Yeah. There's like a riot, pandemonium, and everyone starts yelling, right? Yeah. The point though is, one of the reasons, first of all, it's important to read the Torah scroll so everyone learns the Torah every week. But in addition, it's one of the processes of making sure that the Torah scroll is accurate. Why? Because I'll describe to you what happened was. We were reading the Torah scroll in my synagogue, in my shul, in my neighborhood, and the person who's reading skips a whole sentence, and everyone starts yelling. Now, it's very interesting. If you ever, especially on Shabbat, everyone goes to wash for bread, and between the time you wash bread, you actually make the blessing on the bread and eat it. What are you not allowed to do? You're not allowed to talk. So if you need to say something, what do you do then? There's this very interesting language that Jews have. It goes like this. It goes like, which means you forgot the knife, go bring it from the kitchen, right? And means, Mom, tell him to stop kicking me under the table, he's annoying me, right? And this whole language. So there we are. This guy skipped the whole line. Everyone's screaming and yelling. He goes, which everyone immediately understood to mean, it's not here. So the rabbi comes up, puts on his rabbinic glasses, and looks and goes, mmm. Now what made the story really interesting is the scribe who wrote the scroll was a member of the community who was right there. So he was like, mm-hmm. He comes up and he goes, mm. And he realized he skipped the line because there were two lines that ended and began with the same word. And he just jumped from one to the other, and the whole line was missing. So what you have to do is you have to cut out that whole column, rewrite it, fitting an extra line, and then sew it back in. But the point that we're trying to get at is, in the context of a transmission, you're not going to make mistakes. But every week we take the Torah scroll out and we read it. And hopefully the community is listening. And if there are mistakes, we're going to find it. Because if the Torah scroll is found to be missing a word, or a letter, or even if a letter is broken, a letter is not complete for some reason, there's somehow some of the ink flaked away and now the letter is complete, you put it away, you take you tie, instead of tying your clothes, at least in Ashkenazi Torah scroll, instead of tying your clothes on the inside, you tie your clothes on the outside so everyone knows that this is not correct. And you leave it there till after Shabbat when someone can come and can repair it. Until then, you're not allowed to use it. So one technique that we have is the public reading of the Torah scroll. Okay? Another technique is actually very interesting. Imagine if you had a document with your numerous copies. Again, not photocopies like we're using nowadays, handwritten copies. And you lose the original. And every copy you look at is slightly different. Is there a way by which we could recreate the original?
No.
No? Not at all? I beg to differ. You know how we could recreate the original? Because the different mistakes that are in all these different copies, do you think they're all the same or each mistake is different? Each mistake is different. So let's get as many copies together as we can and then compare them. And mistakes will cancel each other out. And when we can recreate the original document based on comparing as many copies as we possibly could.
But it won't be like the...
No, it would be because here. In other words, we're not talking about when someone is out to change it for some specific reason. Each person who copied the original made their own unique mistake. So if I have 30 copies of the original, there'll be 29 that have one word, and the 30th will have something else. Then a different 29 will have the same word, and a different 30 will have a different word. And by putting them all together, I can recreate the original. Right? That's the process by which you're able to do it. That's been done throughout Jewish history with the Torah. From the time that the Jewish people went into exile, from the destruction of the first temple. So, as we said, the original was already put away about 100 years before that. So there were people went into exile. Whatever Torah scrolls they were able to take with them into the exile is not clear. When they got to Babylon, they rewrote Torah scrolls. But the community was scattered. They were in exile. They weren't organized. Everyone wrote their own Torah scrolls. Okay? After 70 years, the Jews returned to rebuild the Second Temple. Everyone comes back with their Torah scroll. You can well imagine, a bunch of Jews, each community coming back with their own scroll, each community assured that their scroll is correct. So what do? The leader of the return at that time, his name was Ezra the Sofer, Ezra the scribe. And one of the reasons he's called the scribe is because what he did was he said, wait a minute, there's too much argument over here. And he said, everyone, let's collect all the Torah scrolls. He brought all the Torah scrolls to where they were rebuilding the Second Temple, and they went through them. And they said, okay, we have 50, 75, I don't know, I have no clue what the number is. However many scrolls we have, let's go through them. Does everyone agree the first word, the second word, the third word, all the way through? And through that, he was able to recreate an accurate copy of the original from within all the different mistakes of all the individual Torah scrolls that they received. This was done at the beginning of the Second Temple period. It was done later on in the Second Temple period. It was done at different times throughout Jewish history. One of the most well-known that was actually done in modern times, it's already about 50 years ago, is there's what's known as the Jerusalem Bible, the Korean Tanakh, which is more or less accepted as a standard in terms of Tanakh. And it was the return of the Jews to the land of Israel from the various different communities was used as a golden opportunity to be able to do this. We had Jews from Yemen and from Iraq and from Libya and from Hungary and from Poland and Lithuania and from Russia and North America, South America, Germany, and Germany and all the different Jewish communities. They collected scrolls or facsimiles of scrolls and printed Torahs from all these different communities, sat down and went through them. Now, differences in terms of, it's interesting, the Torah scroll itself does not have in it any vowels, right? There's no nekudot. There's no cantillation. The tune is not written down there. That's only printed. And even there's a whole issue in terms of Jewish grammar of the words that are joined together by a makaf, words that are joined together by a line, which shows that these two words, like Shiva Israel, are always joined together as one. You know, they're written as two words, so that there is discussion among different communities about some of those disagreements. But in terms of the actual letters and words of the Torah scroll, there's only one disagreement that was found, meaning there's only one letter that could not be, so to speak, canceled out. There was one group of people said one thing, one group of people said another. It's in Deuteronomy, in the word tsuadaka, which appears in Deuteronomy. It's talking about a person who has a particular blemish and what his halachic status is. And the difference is whether the word is dako with a silent aleph or dako with a silent hey. In fact, for those who know Hebrew grammar, the letter hey over here doesn't even have a dugation. It's a completely silent hey. And most Torah scrolls from the world have it with an aleph. I'm not mistaken, I always forget which one it is. Yemenite Torah scrolls have it with a hey. But aside from that, over 2,000 years of Jewish exile throughout the world, various completely different communities, this is the only place where there was some possibility that maybe there was a disagreement. So 304,805 letters, after 3,300 years, you go back and you look at it, and we can only find one particular point of disagreement between one community and the vast majority of other Jewish communities, because across the board, whether they were Ashkenazi or Sephardi communities, the only one that had the difference was the Yemenite community. So therefore, that process itself, to some degree, has shown its accuracy over the course of all of this copying and transmission over the course of the past 3,300 years. In addition, one last idea. The last commandment mentioned in the Bible, commandment number 613, is every Jew is obligated to write their own Torah scroll. Okay? Now, if it's commanded to write a Torah scroll, I would expect that people would fulfill it, right? Has anyone ever fulfilled the commandment of writing a Torah scroll? Not really. What? Your parents, your father actually wrote a Torah scroll?
No.
He appointed someone as messenger to go ahead to write it for him, which is great. You know, that's tremendous. So I'm actually involved right now in helping a community in America write a Torah scroll. It's about 200,000 shekel for a brand new Torah scroll. It takes about 14 months, 200,000 shekel for a top-of-the-line Cadillac Torah scroll. So, but I'm saying, why is that? Because you have to write it on parchment. You have to write, the letters are written, for example, the letter Shin, that's a letter Shin. But the letter Shin in the Torah scroll takes me like 13 movements of my pen to be able to write it. I'm not finished yet because I have to put little crowns on the top over here. So part of the reason why we can conjecture is, yes, it's a commandment to write a Torah scroll, but if everyone's writing their own scroll, there'll be such a mess of Torah scrolls that everyone will be like just zooming their way through it to finish as fast as they can. It won't be accurate. So therefore, yes, it's important to write a scroll, but it's going to be written with all kinds of very strict calligraphy and strict rules so that it's written accurately and carefully, and we don't have this mess of Torah scrolls, each one we need a different direction. So in terms of the idea of the transmission of the written part of the Torah, there's a system of checks and balances, to use an American term, in terms of how we're going to go ahead and at least have some idea, some process by which we can talk about an accurate transmission of a written document. Okay, any questions till now? Now we get to the thing that is, in a sense, the most difficult, which 20 minutes doesn't do justice to, but at least it's something to talk about, which is the idea of the transmission of an oral. And the truth is, you really need to ask in general. There's the concept in the Torah of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, and you really need to ask a very basic question. Why do we even need an oral law? What purpose is there? Let's just write it all down. Let it all be perfectly clear. And why do we have to keep on going to ask people about an oral law when just write it down is that much simpler? So I'd like to just begin to answer that. Actually, it's not a new question. The Talmud actually tells us that there were two great sages in the time of the Mishnah, Hillel and Shammai, very famous people. And there's a whole series of events recounted that took place where people who wanted to convert, they came to Hillel and asked him, they came to Shammai and asked him, and the various responses. So the Talmud tells us that a non-Jew came to Hillel, said he'd like to convert. Hillel said, sure, great, no problem. He says, wait, I have a condition. What's your condition? I want to convert, but only based on the written law, not the oral law. We expected Hillel to say, no, nothing to do it. What are you talking about? You can't do it. He says, sure, no problem. He says, really? He says, sure, no problem. He says, Okay, when do we start? Say we start right now. Okay, what's the first lesson? You got to know the Hebrew alphabet. So lesson number 1 is Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Study this and come back tomorrow. I says, okay. Writes it down. Scroll. Looks at Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Okay, got it. Comes back the next day. Says, okay, well, I'm ready for lesson number 2. Hillel says, lesson number 2 is Aleph, Beis, Gimel. The guy says, but yesterday you told me that this, told me? No, that's oral law. You only want written law, right? It's impossible to know any body of information without an oral background. For example, how are they able to read hieroglyphics? When were they able to begin to decipher hieroglyphics? Only when they found a very particular stone, the Rosetta Stone. What was unique about them? The people who had dug up sphinxes and pyramids in Egypt had found all this writing on it, but no one spoke the language or had any clue what it was. It was a completely sealed book till they found a stone, it's known as the Rosetta Stone, that had hieroglyphics translated into ancient Greek. And because we knew ancient Greek, we were then able to figure out what the hieroglyphics meant, and then they were able to decipher the stones. If no one speaks the language, it's sort of like in my educational career, I never studied calculus. No, I'm sure if I opened up a book of calculus, every single individual symbol in the book, whether it's numbers, letters, even Greek letters I'm sort of familiar with, I know what they are, but I have no clue what calculus is. Or to use a different example, it's like I open a book in French. I don't speak French. I know every letter in the French alphabet. It's the same as the English alphabet. But I have no clue what this means. Until someone will explain to me, just reading a French book is not going to be enough. So therefore, in a certain sense, the idea of the oral law is not just about an oral law, something that we're going to transmit, but it's something which is very basic to an understanding of what we're talking about, to an even greater degree when we're talking about something which is not just a series of facts, but an approach. And therefore, what's taught in the transmission of the oral law is not just so much facts, as more an approach and a methodology as to how to begin to approach the material that we're studying. Which is why if anyone thinks about any kind of study on any level, there's a certain, it's not just enough to know the facts. If you want to develop it beyond that, you need a feeling and an understanding of the process within which you're able to use those facts. For example, a classic example of this is anyone here a physician, a doctor? No? A doctor?
Optometrist.
Optometrist. No, that's not the same. I look at a doctor. You know what doctors hate the most nowadays? People who come to their office having researched what they think they have on the internet. Right? And you know what? The internet's a great place. And even if I look at only the best websites, I look at the National Institute of Health and other such websites, the Mayo Clinic. But even so, here's a doctor. What did they study? They didn't just study what's printed. They went to a hospital with a mentor for a year, for 2 years, for 4 years, whether it's internship, whether it's medical school, internship, residency, post-residency, whatever it is. And they imbibe an entire approach to viewing and understanding what's going on. And as much as you want to write this down, there's a certain approach which is only imbibed by being in such a setting and sort of by osmosis being able to appreciate it. So when we talk about an oral law, what we're really talking about is not just a transmission of a set of facts, but a transmission of an approach and a way by which we're able to utilize the facts that we have to be able to understand them and utilize them in a different way. So therefore, when we talk, the idea, the concept of the oral law really is on two sides, so to speak. One is, no body of information can be understood without a certain basic understanding of what it's meant to be beforehand. It's sort of like, here, one of my grandchildren, now he's about 4 years old now. When he was about 2 years old, it was, for people my age to watch, even though I have a phone, I have a smartphone, I use it, they know how to use it, I'm afraid of anything. But it's unbelievable to watch 2-year-old kids with a smartphone. It's like intuitive. My grandson was all the time visiting my mother-in-law, his great-grandmother. And she actually has like an old phone. It's not a smartphone, it's not touch, it's not anything. And he took her phone, he started going like this to the screen, nothing happened, he said, broken! He threw it on the floor. Luckily it was an old phone, so it didn't break when you throw it on the floor. But I'm saying there's no one has to teach kids nowadays how to swipe through a phone. It's part of, it's sort of like, I'd say it's like the first time you get into a car when you're a teenager. And, your parent gives you the keys and says, okay. No, it's the same. You take the key, you hold the silver part sticking out, there's a little slot on the steering column you need to fit it in, and you need to turn it clockwise, which no one knows what that means nowadays anymore. You need to turn it clockwise. You've been riding in the back of your parents' car from when you were an infant. There's like, it's part of the process within which you exist. It's actually funny because I was in the States this summer. My brother gave me the keys to his car, and I couldn't figure out where the keys were or where the slot was because he has one of these new Audis that doesn't even have a key. It just has this little thing that you have to put in the right place. I couldn't figure out how to get his car started.
You don't even have to put it in the
You have to put it, whatever. I was like trying to figure out how to start this car. Where's the key? Where does it go? And he called him, I knocked him, went back out and said, how do you start your stupid car? There's no key. He said, it's a lot smarter than you are, but okay. But I'm saying there's a certain aspect of that. It's the first part of the oral law. It's the framework within which the whole thing exists. The second part is so to speak, all the way on the other side. It's now that we have these laws, how do we apply them? For example, what do we do about electricity? To go back 100, 130 years ago, right? How do we take the information that we have and the system that exists and apply it now to a new situation that we never had before? And therefore there's, in terms of yes, it would be nice if everything was written down, but it's sort of like, it's like, I just had this happen this afternoon. Among other things I do is I write computer programs. And one of the banes of writing a computer program is interface. Because you have to try to think of every possible way the person who's using the program can mess up and try to lock them in that they can't make that mistake. And I wrote a program for someone recently, and then I get an email today. Someone figured out how to mess up in a way that you didn't think of beforehand. What are we going to do now? Right? The oral law is human beings are, inexhaustible when it comes to ways by which they can make mistakes and mess things up. There's, in a sense, look, God is, all knowing, all powerful. But in a sense, writing down every possible way and what the result of that is just inefficient. It's much more efficient to give us a set of, if you want to say, a set of, not laws, but a set of processes by which we're able to then evaluate each new situation that comes up and how we're then going to deal with it. And in a sense, that's what the oral law is. Not just, it's not a set of pieces of information. The oral law is a process, is a thought process by which one develops the ability to apply existing facts and existing approaches to brand new situations. How do you acquire such an approach? Right? How do you do that? So again, it's the same idea. It's the idea of osmosis. It's the idea of the more one studies and the more one, sinks themselves into the existing process, the better you're then able to anticipate what the result should be. It's almost counterintuitive. Everyone always wants to come up with something new. But when you're studying Torah, the best that you can happen is come up with something old. Because if I'm studying the Torah, I'm studying the Talmud, and I have an idea, a question, and then I come up with an answer. And then I find that question and answer in one of the commentaries from 300-400 years ago. I'm ecstatic. Because that means that I lined up my thought process with his. Right? Which means that over all the years that I've been studying, I've been studying probably now for 40-something years, it means that some or other I've sunken into it enough that I'm now able to anticipate what the thought process in order to reach proper conclusions. If I come up with something, sometimes, again, it's counterintuitive. Sometimes I come up with an idea that's so new, and I search for it, especially nowadays. A large portion of Talmudic literature is actually now found on searchable databases. So you can actually look for ideas. And if I don't find it, I begin to get nervous. Because if it's such a good idea, why did anyone else come up with it before me? Because I'm not the smartest guy in the world by a long shot. And it's almost counterintuitive in that sense. And the more one is able to find themselves aligned along with the thought process, the more you're able to then figure out what it is. And if we think about it, that's really what that's what Talmud study is about. It's really an immersion in the thought process. To that, it's sort of like if you ever took a piece of metal and magnetized it. Take a piece of metal, you take a magnet, and you rub the magnet on it until the piece of metal itself becomes magnetized. What's actually happening? The electrons inside this other piece of metal are all now being aligned the same way by being in contact with the original magnet. And in a sense, that's what a student is trying to do in terms of Talmud study, is align his thought process along with the existing thought process and be able to look themselves back. I studied from my teacher, studied from his teacher, and in a sense go all the way back to the giving of the Torah back to over there. So when we talk about a oral transmission, we're not talking about a transmission in terms of individual pieces of information, which is also to some degree true. We're talking much more about the transmission of the process, which requires this kind of transmission. Even so, and I'll finish with two last points. One is, even so, you might think, a transmission like this sounds like a game of, telephone. Whisper something in one person's ear, whatever, 3,300 years. There's a fascinating document. It's available in different places on the internet. A well-known rabbi here, Zev Rudman, actually wrote it. He traced from himself back to Moses, step by step, every single teacher. His teacher, to his teacher, to his teacher, all the way back. When he finished, and every single person in there, going back to the time of the beginning of the Second Temple, going back 2,800 years, is a historical figure who existed, that we know when and where they lived and died. It's 66 people. So the line of transmission from Mount Sinai to us is less than 70 people. Okay? That's a lot different than talking about 3,300 years. It's less than 70 people. And lastly, I'd like to share a story with you in the Talmud, which goes like this. Talmud tells us the following. I like to try to end my time so people, because everyone else likes to end their time. The teachers take too long, it goes too long, so I'll sort of condense it. Talmud tells a story that happened here in Jerusalem during the time at the end of the Second Temple period. It was during the time, once again, of Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were the leaders of the heads, the Rosh Yeshiva, the leading yeshiva of their time. And in those days, they would study. The leader, the rabbis would sit like on a stage. The students would sit around. The rabbis would debate while the students listened to the give and take, trying to anticipate it once again to develop this thought process themselves. And there's a tremendous argument between Hillel and Shammai about a very obscure piece of information in the laws of ritual purity. And it seems this argument spread the whole city, all Jerusalem were talking about it. And in the midst of their debate, the second or third day of their debate, the door opens and in walk, Talmud describes, doesn't say their names, tells us who they were. They were two tanners who lived in Sha'ar Ashpot, in the Dung Gate. Now one can well imagine the Dung Gate was not like the upper class neighborhood of Jerusalem. Tanners, in a number of places in the Talmud, being a tanner was considered the lowest possible profession in that period of time. You stunk of acid, whatever, that went into the place. There are a number of very interesting halachos about a person who's a tanner because they were on such a low socioeconomic run. These two guys walk in, and the Talmud tells us, and they walk into the yeshiva, and they walk up to the front and say, Hillel and Shammai, we have a tradition about the argument that you're having. We heard differently from your teachers. It's not like Hillel, it's not like Shammai, there's a third approach. And they say, fascinating, unbelievable, tell it to us. They listen to it, and the Talmud says the halacha was decided that day in yeshiva according to the two tanners from the Dung Gate. If this was a fairy tale, how it would end? They went, they took a bunch of showers, they put on some deodorant, some cologne, and they came to two well-known rabbis. They don't appear anywhere else in the Talmud. They don't. Studying for many years, they don't appear anywhere else in the Talmudic literature. And Rashi over there tells us, you know why we're told who they were? Because the Talmud is telling us is that the transmission of the Torah is not up to the heads of the yeshiva. Every single Jew has their piece of the Torah. It's theirs. And whoever they are, they're part of the process of transmission. And it's everyone's responsibility to take that piece and bring it in because the Torah is given to the Jewish people as a whole. And everyone is responsible for the transmission of that part of the Torah. For people, especially who come to discovery, take the time and effort to come to discovery, this is part of the process of transmission in our generation. Everyone having their part of the Torah, getting it, and then transmitting it on to the next generation. Thank you. Rest of the nice day. Okay. Any questions? I'll be happy to. I am a little bit rushed, but any questions, I'll be happy to talk for a few minutes.